By the summer of 1945, one Soviet tank had already done the impossible. It had beaten Germany. The T-34-85 had rolled from the gates of Moscow to the rubble of Berlin, and the war in Europe was over. Most of the world thought the fighting was finished too. But 2,000 miles to the east, Japan still held a giant. In the fields and mountains of Manchuria sat the Kwantung Army, somewhere between 700,000 and a full million men. For years it had been the pride of the Japanese Empire, the army that had never been beaten, the army that was supposed to hold the line no matter what came. And then, just after midnight on the 9th of August, the same tank that had crushed Hitler came pouring out of the desert and the mountains. In 11 days, it smashed that giant into nothing. This is the story of how the T-34-85 ran down the Kwantung Army before that army could even fight back. How Soviet armor crossed a mountain range the Japanese swore no tank could ever cross. And why the last great field army of Imperial Japan collapsed in less than 2 weeks. Let me take you back to where this really begins. It is the spring of 1945, and the Red Army is a different animal than it was 4 years earlier. In 1941, the Germans had nearly destroyed it. By 1945, it had learned to do one thing better than any army on earth. It had learned how to punch a hole in a line and pour tanks through it faster than the enemy could react. The weapon at the center of that skill was the T-34-85. To understand why it mattered so much here, you have to understand where it came from. The original T-34 had shocked the Germans back in 1941 with its sloped armor and its wide tracks that floated over mud and snow. For its first 2 years, it carried a 76.2mm gun, and against the early German tanks, that gun was enough. It was more than enough. German crews who met the T-34 in the opening months of the invasion wrote home in something close to panic. But war does not stand still, and neither did the Germans. By 1943, they were fielding heavier tanks with thicker armor and longer guns. And suddenly, the T-34's 76.2mm cannon was no longer cutting through what it met. The Soviets had a choice. Design a brand new tank from scratch, which would have slowed the factories to a crawl, or upgrade the machine they already trusted. They chose the upgrade. They enlarged the turret ring, dropped in a bigger 3-man turret, and fitted an 85mm gun in place of the old one. That extra crewman mattered as much as the bigger shell, because now the commander could command instead of also working the gun. The T-34-85 was born, and it was a better fighting machine in almost every way that counted. It was not the heaviest tank in the world. It was not the best armored. What it was fast, reliable, and built in numbers nobody else could match. It could move at about 34 miles an hour on a good road. Its tracks could carry it across ground that bogged down everything else. And the factories behind the Urals were stamping them out by the thousand, more than any other tank on the planet, month after month after month. That combination is the whole reason this story happens the way it does. Because the plan Moscow was about to attempt depended on speed. Brutal, relentless speed. Armor that broke down in the first 100 miles would have been worthless here. Armor that needed a paved road would have been worthless here. The T-34-85 needed neither, and that is exactly why it was chosen for the hardest road of the entire war. Now, before the tanks could do anything, they had to get there. And this is a part of the story almost nobody talks about. The Soviet Union had just finished 4 years of the bloodiest land war in history, and it had finished it on the wrong side of the continent. Every tank army, every veteran crew, every supply dump was sitting in Eastern Europe, 2 whole continents away from Manchuria. To attack Japan, Stalin had to pick up enormous chunks of the Red Army and physically move them across the entire length of the Soviet Union. The distance is hard to picture. From the western USSR to the Far East was roughly 5,600 miles of single rail line, the Trans-Siberian, threading through forest and steppe and over rivers.
Whole tank units, infantry divisions, fuel, ammunition, and spare engines were loaded onto freight trains and sent rolling east for weeks at a time. and it had to be done quietly. If the Japanese had seen the scale of the build-up, they could have dug in deeper, pulled men back, prepared for the blow. So the Soviets hid it. They moved at night where they could, disguised the trains as ordinary freight, and kept the soldiers in the dark about where they were even going until they arrived. Veteran commanders who had broken German armies at Kursk and in Belorussia stepped off trains into a landscape they had never seen, half a world from the war they had just won. It was one of the largest secret military movements ever attempted, and the Japanese never grasped how big it was until the tanks were already on top of them. By early August, the pieces were in place. Now, let me show you what they were aimed at. Here is the situation Japan was in. For years, the Kwantung Army had been the empire's crown jewel, sitting in Manchuria, guarding the border with the Soviet Union. But as the Pacific War turned against Japan, the empire started robbing this army to feed the islands. The best divisions got shipped out, the newest tanks got shipped out, the modern guns got shipped out. What was left behind looked impressive on paper and was hollow underneath. Hundreds of thousands of men, yes, but many of them poorly equipped, and a large share of them raw recruits and hastily called up reservists who had never fought a real battle. Their tanks were mostly pre-war models. Their anti-tank guns were obsolete. Their training had been stripped down to fill the ranks that the Pacific had drained. The name was still terrifying. The army underneath the name was a shell of what it had once been. And their commanders had built their entire defense on one belief. That belief was simple. They thought the western approach to Manchuria was impossible for an army. To the west sat the Gobi Desert, then the Greater Khingan Mountains, peaks rising to about 6,600 feet, wrapped in forests and gorges and swampy passes. The Japanese looked at that wall of rock and sand and decided no large tank force could ever cross it. They expected the main Soviet blow to come from the east, where the rivers and the railheads were, and they put their strength there. To the west, behind the mountains, they put their weakest defenses, because why guard a door that cannot be opened? That decision is the thread the entire campaign hangs on, because the Soviets looked at the exact same mountains and saw an open door. Pay attention to this next part, because it explains everything that follows. The Soviet plan was a giant pincer. Two huge forces would close on the Kwantung Army from opposite directions. From the east came the first Far Eastern Front, driving in through the river country the Japanese had braced for. From the west, across the desert and the mountains the Japanese thought were safe, came the Transbaikal Front under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky. The whole operation was placed under Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, the man who had helped plan the destruction of the Germans, now turned loose on the last enemy standing. And the tip of that western spear was the 6th Guards Tank Army, led by General Andrei Kravchenko. This was the unit that would do the impossible thing. It was not a single column of tanks. It was a combined force built around 3 corps, the 5th Guards Tank Corps, the 7th Mechanized Corps, and the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps, with brigades of Su-100 self-propelled guns and motorized infantry riding along to hold what the tanks took. All told, more than 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, the core of them T-34-85s, with American-built Shermans delivered through Lend-Lease, rolling in the same columns. Their orders were almost insane. Cross the Gobi Desert, climb the Greater Khingan Mountains, reach the central Manchurian plains on the other side, and do it in about 5 days. Not capture a city in 5 days. Cross a desert and a mountain range in 5 days, then come down the far slope behind the enemy before the enemy even understood what was happening. Across the whole Far East, the Soviets had gathered over 5,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, 5,556 to be exact, the largest armoured force ever assembled against Japan. But it was this one army, in this one place, that would decide how fast the giant fell. Everything came down to whether Kravchenko's tanks could beat the terrain. For a while, things actually seemed quiet. The Japanese border guards on the night of August 8th had no reason to expect anything. The mountains behind them were doing their job in their minds, standing watch so the soldiers did not have to. And then the sky opened. Just after midnight on the 9th of August, the offensive began. No long warning bombardment in the west. In Europe, the Red Army had announced its big attacks with thousands of guns hammering the line for hours. Here, Malinowski threw that playbook away. A bombardment would have warned the enemy and slowed the tanks, so there was none. The tanks simply rolled, in the dark, in the rain, straight into the desert. Speed was the whole point. Every hour the Japanese spent confused was an hour the 6th Guards Tank Army turned into miles. And the miles came fast. The lead columns covered enormous distances in a single day. The fastest units pushed close to 100 miles in 24 hours. Think about that for a second. These were not light scout vehicles. These were medium tanks and tank destroyers grinding across open desert at a pace that would have impressed any army in the world. There was no enemy line to break in front of them, because the enemy had decided this ground did not need defending. The only thing fighting them was the land itself. The Gobi tried to stop them first. Stretches of dry, sandy steppe that swallowed wheeled trucks whole. Heat by day that shimmered off the steel and cooked the crews inside their hulls. Then, as they climbed, sudden mountain rain that turned the passes to mud. Drinking water ran short because there was none to be found in the sand, and the supply trucks struggled where the tanks did not. The T-34-85's wide tracks were built for exactly this. Where a heavier tank would have sunk, the T-34 floated and kept moving, spreading its weight across the soft ground that trapped everything else. But the desert was the easy part. The mountains were the test. The Greater Khingan Range was the wall the Japanese had bet their whole defense on. Steep forest slopes, narrow gorges, passes that turned to bog when it rained. No good roads, in many places no roads at all, just goat tracks and dry stream beds. The kind of terrain where a single broken-down tank can plug a pass and freeze an entire column behind it for hours, leaving them stacked up and helpless if anyone had been there to hit them. The Soviet tankers went up it anyway. This is where the campaign was actually won. Not in any single firefight, but in the engineering. Engineers worked ahead of the columns, cutting tracks into the slopes with hand tools and explosives, laying logs across the soft spots, shoring up crossings over the gorges. Crews winched their tanks up grades too steep to climb under power, hooking cables to anything solid and dragging 30-plus tons of steel up by the foot. Where the slope dropped away on the far side, they rode the brakes down inch by inch, knowing a slip meant a tank in the ravine. The advanced detachments fought the mountain more than they fought the Japanese, because the Japanese were barely there. Remember, this was the direction nobody thought needed defending. And in about a day of that brutal work, the lead detachments did the thing the Kwantung Army had sworn was impossible. They crossed the Greater Khingan. By the 12th of August, the leading tanks of the 6th Guards Tank Army were down off the eastern slopes and out onto the central Manchurian plain, taking the town of Lubei, appearing in the enemy's rear like ghosts. In 3 days, they had done what the Japanese High Command had ruled out entirely. Picture it from the Japanese side. You have built your entire plan around the idea that the mountains protect your flank. You have spent your strength facing east, watching the rivers, waiting for the blow you were sure would come from there. You wake up and there are hundreds of T-34s coming down out of the western mountains,
behind your strongest positions, with nothing between them and the heart of Manchuria. The shield did not just fail. It became the very road the enemy used to get behind you. That was the moment the giant started to fall. If you are finding this story as wild as I do, take 1 second and hit subscribe. This channel digs into the weapons and battles of the Eastern Front every week, the ones most people never hear about. Now back to the mountains and the part where the tankers nearly beat themselves. Because here is the problem with moving that fast. You outrun everything behind you. By the middle of August, the 6th Guards Tank Army had pushed so far, so quickly, that its fuel trucks could not keep up. The same wide tracks and hard driving that carried the tanks over the mountains burned gasoline at a frightening rate, and the supply columns were still grinding through the passes the tanks had already cleared. Tanks that had crossed a desert and a mountain range now sat on the plains with their fuel tanks running dry. A tank with no fuel is just a steel box. It cannot maneuver, it cannot chase, it can barely turn its turret. For a day or two, the entire spearhead was in real danger of grinding to a halt, deep behind enemy lines, exactly where a stranded force is most vulnerable. If the Kwantung Army had been the army of 1939, this is the moment it would have counterattacked and made the Soviets pay. So, the Soviets did something that tells you how committed they were to keeping the pace. They flew the fuel in. Transport planes ferried gasoline forward over the mountains to the stalled columns, hundreds of tons of it, landing on rough strips or dropping it to the tanks that had outrun their own supply lines. It was rough, it was improvised, and it worked. The engines coughed back to life, the crews topped off their tanks straight from the drums, and the spearhead kept rolling east before the Kwantung Army could organize anything to stop it. This is the detail that separates this campaign from a simple steamroll. The Soviets were not just stronger, they were willing to take real risks and improvise under pressure to keep the enemy from ever catching his balance. Speed was not a happy accident here. It was a decision they paid for and protected, even when their own machines tried to quit on them. Now, what about the Japanese soldiers in the path of all this? They were not cowards. In places, they fought hard, and in some isolated strongpoints, they fought to the last man. The question is, why their fighting barely mattered. The answer comes down to the gear they had been left with. When a Japanese gun crew did get a shot at a T-34-85, they were often firing a 37mm anti-tank gun. Back in 1939, at the border battles against thin-skinned Soviet light tanks, that gun had done its job. Against the sloped, thick armor of a T-34-85 in 1945, it was nearly useless. The shells came in and skipped off the angled plate, or buried themselves without punching through to anything that mattered. A weapon that had been respectable 6 years earlier was now a pop gun against a moving wall. The Japanese tanks were no better off. Most were pre-war designs, lightly armored, with small guns built to fight infantry and other light tanks. Not a modern medium tank with an 85mm cannon. Even their best models were hopelessly outclassed. A Soviet crew could spot a Japanese tank, fire, and destroy it at a range where the Japanese shell, if it even reached, would simply bounce. It was not a duel. It was target practice in one direction. So, you had a wall of Soviet armor that the defenders could see, could shoot at, and simply could not stop. And when men cannot stop what is coming at them, the most desperate of them did the only thing left. Some Japanese soldiers strapped explosives to their bodies and threw themselves at the tracks, trying to disable the tanks, one suicide attack at a time. Packing charges into satchels and waiting in ditches for a hull to roll past. A few tanks were damaged this way. It changed nothing about the outcome. It tells you everything about the mismatch. The defense had been reduced to flesh against 40 tons of moving steel. When your last anti-tank weapon is a man with a bomb tied to his chest, the battle is already decided. You are no longer trying to win.
You are only trying to make the enemy slow down, and these tanks would not slow down. By now, the trap was closing from both sides. The Transbaikal front was pouring out of the western mountains and onto the plain. The first Far Eastern front was driving in from the east, through the country the Japanese had actually braced for, and even there the defense was buckling.
And the Kwantung Army, the giant that was never supposed to break, was being cut into pieces it could not reconnect, the two Soviet pincers reaching toward each other through the middle of Manchuria. The speed is what killed them. A slower advance would have given Japanese commanders time to pull back, form a new line, fight a real defensive battle on ground of their choosing. The T-34-85 never gave them that time. Soviet tanks reached road junctions, river crossings, supply depots, and headquarters before the orders to defend them could even arrive. Telephone lines were cut by tanks before the warnings could travel down them. Whole Japanese formations found themselves surrounded before they had fired a serious shot, getting orders to hold positions that the Soviets had already driven past. This is the difference between losing a battle and being smashed. The Kwantung Army was not beaten in a stand-up fight. It was run down, overtaken, cut off and collapsed from the inside, while it was still trying to figure out where the enemy even was. An army that cannot find the enemy cannot fight the enemy. And by the time most Japanese units understood the shape of what was happening, the war behind them had already been decided. And the clock on all of this was brutally short. On the 14th of August, the Emperor of Japan accepted the terms of surrender, and on the 15th, his voice went out over the radio to the nation. But an order in Tokyo does not stop a tank in Manchuria. Many Kwantung Army units kept fighting, either because the order had not reached them across cut communications, or because they refused to believe it, or because the Soviets bearing down on them did not pause. The Soviet advance did not slow down to wait for paperwork. To Moscow, every day of continued advance meant more ground held when the shooting finally stopped. The formal ceasefire on that front did not come until the 17th, and scattered fighting and surrenders dragged on for days after that. By then, it was already over. The 6th Guards Tank Army and the forces around it had driven roughly 509 miles across some of the worst terrain in Asia, desert and mountain and plain, in less time than many armies needed just to plan an attack. Organized Japanese resistance broke apart in about 11 days, from the 9th of August to the 20th. 11 days to destroy an army that had stood as Japan's shield for more than a decade. Stop and measure that against everything else in the war. Battles that decided far less had ground on for months. Stalingrad alone had lasted into a 6th month. Here, the last great field army of Imperial Japan, hundreds of thousands of men, was overrun in less time than many single battles in Europe had taken from start to finish. The numbers that surrendered ran into the hundreds of thousands, marched into captivity by an enemy that had appeared out of mountains they were told no one could cross. So, why did it happen this fast, and what does it actually tell us? It comes back to the tank in the middle of the story. The T-34-85 did not win this campaign by being the toughest machine on the battlefield. There were heavier tanks, better armoured tanks, tanks with bigger guns. It won by being fast enough, reliable enough, and available in enough numbers to do something no one believed could be done. Cross a desert and a mountain range, on a deadline, climb where engineers had to cut the road by hand, and arrive in the enemy's rear before the enemy could turn around. The strength of the T-34-85 was never just its gun or its armour. It was that you could ask it to do the impossible and it would actually get there. The Japanese had bet everything on geography. They trusted the Greater Khingan to do the work that men and guns could not. They faced the wrong way, guarded the wrong door, and left their weakest troops to watch the one approach that mattered. And the T-34-85 turned that wall of mountains from a shield into a highway, coming down the far side and unhinging the entire defense in a matter of days. The mountains the Japanese counted on did not protect them. They simply hid the blow until it was too late to answer. Think back to where we started. One tank, the same model, that had already beaten Germany in the longest, bloodiest land war in history. It had fought from Moscow to Berlin, through 3 winters and 1,000 miles of someone else's homeland. Most armies would have called that a career. Instead, weeks after Berlin fell, that same machine was loaded onto trains, hauled 5,000 miles across the world, and hurled across a desert and a mountain to finish the last giant standing. It did the job in 11 days. If you want to see how the same Eastern Front armour was used against a very different enemy, there is a video on screen right now that breaks down another one of these forgotten campaigns. Go watch it next. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.